You guys remember Be the Church Day? Seems like ages ago. It was really, like 2 weeks ago? But we wanted to put Rob Glessner actually put that together for you guys, and we put it out on the web, on our YouTube channel. You guys can see that yourself. You can show it to other people, give them an idea of what our church does. How about a big hand for Paul and Rachel on the soundtrack for that, huh? All right. I know that they weren't really realizing that was going to happen when they were leading that song a couple Saturdays ago. Yeah, so how's it going? Good. My name's Jason. If you are having a hard time placing me, see, recognize me now? There you go. Yeah, if this is your first time here this morning, I don't normally do this whole preaching thing. I'm probably like the Rudy of our preaching bench. And when I do preach, I usually get tossed a softball of a passage relating to worship or something thereabouts, which is really more in line with my passions and talents. But today I get the honor of talking about adultery with you all. Yay. So, for you first-timers, if I really screw this up, don't worry, Matt will be back next week. Please give us another chance. So one of the snags I was running into this week as I was working on this, and perhaps this is due to my lack of preaching experience, was this introduction, ironically. It was one of those never quite found anything that clicked / completely ran out of time combinations that perhaps you've probably experienced before. And I thought about maybe just getting up here and talking about the Cardinals, because other than Blake and JR and probably Chuck, who really doesn't want to talk about the Cardinals this morning, or I thought maybe some gimmick where we finally get someone to try to kick a field goal on this thing behind me just to kind of warm the crowd up. But neither one of those things really had a lot to do with the topic at hand. Actually, nothing to do with the topic at hand. So I went to the old international movie, I think it was international. I guess now it's internet. Yeah, this really messes up my jokes. So I went to the Internet Movie Database. If you ever check that out, imdb.com, it's this database of movies, like every movie, and some of them are even international, so it still works. And I thought about falling back on the old find a movie clip about adultery strategy, but when I searched the keyword adultery, it turned up 2,281 movies and 1,029 television episodes, and I really didn't have time to watch all of that and sift through it. But it got me thinking, why are there so many movies about adultery? I mean, there's only 443 about baseball. There's only 11 about hobbits. It is a shame, isn't it? And that's including the 2 that are slated to come out. So what is it about adultery that captures the attention of our society? I mean, is it the scandal or the juicy gossip? Does it make us feel a little better about ourselves in light of someone else's moral failure? I mean, the media machine and the internets are abuzz every time a celebrity or a politician gets caught literally with their pants down. Stories of forbidden love fill books, plays, and movies. Have you ever noticed how often we actually find ourselves rooting for the adulterers to get together in these things? I don't think it'd be far off in suggesting that as a society, as a people, we don't really get marriage, sex, fidelity, adultery. There's actually lots of other things we really don't get as well. But God wants to help us figure this out. Find the best way to live our lives, both for our own sakes and for His glory. And one of His early attempts to do this was through something that is very popularly known as the 10 Commandments. We've been looking at these commandments for the last several weeks, trying to understand them better, trying to figure out how we can apply them, how they still impact and shape our lives even thousands of years later. And we're up to the 7th commandment now. So we got 3 more to go after this. And so we're at the 7th commandment, which I'm going to read. If you'd like to follow along, you can open your Bibles. We're starting at Exodus 20:14, or you can follow along on the screens. Starting at Exodus 20:14. You shall not commit adultery. Our second of 4 pretty short commandments text doesn't really give us a lot to work with or dig into. The Hebrew could also be translated, thou shalt not commit adultery, if that helps you at all. But I guess the key in getting this commandment is making sure that we have a solid understanding of what it means to commit adultery. So what is adultery? I mean, I would guess the first thought that jumps into most of our heads is pretty much in line with how the dictionary defines it. Voluntary sexual intercourse between a married man and someone other than his wife, or a married woman and someone other than her husband. But that's not exactly how the people receiving this commandment probably would have understood it. I mean, to the ancient Israelite, adultery really actually had nothing to do with the marital status of the guy. It was the married or engaged woman that caused the hookup to be considered adulterous. And I realize this sounds a little weird and uneven to say the least, but you also got to realize that ancient Israel was a polygamous culture. It wasn't frowned upon for a man to have more than one wife or a baby mama of some sort. Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon, they were all heroes that had these wives, these concubines. And now, whether this was really cool with God or not, that's a topic for a whole nother sermon altogether. But if a married man was caught with an unmarried woman, he basically had to pay a fine to the woman's father, and then he had to marry her, but it wasn't considered adultery. So should this be our working definition in trying to understand and find application for this commandment? Probably not. I mean, for one, our society is generally ostensibly monogamous. So I think we could probably add married man with unmarried woman to the list of offenders. Another way that people might have interpreted this commandment is through what we'll call the rule of categories. The basic idea is that the commandments are short, easy to remember phrases, but they represent a whole category of sin. So the prohibition lists an extreme form of the sin and then acts as an umbrella covering all perceived lesser forms of the same type. So the commandment, thou shalt not murder, would also in effect prohibit any sort of physical violence that doesn't quite take someone's life, like beating someone up or domestic violence. The commandment against adultery then would have been designed to prohibit sexual sin, sex apart from God's purposes of procreation and enjoyment between spouses. And this certainly would make sense when you look at the incredibly lengthy and graphic list of laws regarding sexual issues found mainly in Leviticus 15 and 20. Things like, don't do it with your father's wife. Or how about, don't do it with your wife and her mom. So while this rule of categories is intriguing and may have some merit, the fact remains that the text is concise on the matter. And to complicate things, we are a loophole people. Are we not? I mean, if we aren't explicitly told something, how can we be held accountable for it, right? I get this from my kids all the time. I'll say, it's a beautiful day outside. I don't want you in here playing video games all afternoon. And then I'll come downstairs 10 minutes later and they're watching TV. They would be, and have been, quick to point out that I did not prohibit the watching of TV, only the playing of video games. But they missed the point. And I'm not any better. I mean, here's a self-revealing, topically relevant example. I mean, many years ago, after repenting of my own budding addiction to internet pornography, what did I do? I started becoming more keenly aware of R-rated movies that might have nudity or some gratuitous sex scene. But hey, at least I wasn't looking at porn on the internet anymore, right? I mean, that was the face I had given to my demon. I mean, that was what God had convicted me about. Sometimes I think we not only miss the point, we go out of our way to avoid the point. When we go looking for loopholes to get around God's intentions for us and start holding his commands to the letters on the page so as not to be challenged or have to face change. We're in the same place as the Israelites, who we've seen on many occasions in our studies as having an uncanny knack for missing the point completely. We're in the same place as those darn Pharisees that Jesus had oh so much respect for. And one of the dangers of missing the point comes in its perpetuation. When generation after generation misses the point, eventually preceding generations stop questioning, stop seeking, stop wondering if there's anything deeper that could possibly be missed. I mean, the wrong point becomes enshrined and protected by tradition, ignorance, probably some arrogance. And that's what Jesus is speaking into when he gives his Sermon on the Mount, which fortunately for our purposes this morning has a nice little section on adultery that goes a little something like this. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. So here again, Jesus raises the bar. If you were here last week, you remember Matt talked about how we like to keep the bar low. He probably did something like that. Low. When it comes to rules and laws, to make sure that we clear it. It's the same tendency that causes us to seek out loopholes so that we can get away with as much as possible. In its simplistically written state, the seventh commandment isn't that hard to keep. Probably not as easy as not murdering someone. I mean, in fact, I'm nearly certain that there are people in this room who have committed or have been affected by even this low bar version of adultery. And so I really just wanted to pause for a second, if that's you, and just reassure you that I'm not up here this morning to judge you or belittle your struggle. In fact, I hope you hear me when I say that I have never thought or ever even considered the fact that I would be any better than you. I've had people confess affairs to me before and been surprised myself at how little my thoughts and opinions of them have been affected. I mostly feel love and sadness for their pain. And that's not to condone the act by any stretch of the imagination. But sex is a powerful force in humanity. It can result in some of the greatest joys and in some of the deepest hurts known to man. That's why we spent the first part of this year taking a look at God's view of and purposes for sex. And if you miss those messages, you can get them. You just need to hear them again, maybe. You can get them on our website. You can ask Heather. She'd be more than happy to run the CDs for you. All that to say, as a fellow sinner, I empathize with the struggle and guilt attached to sexual sin. I've struggled with my fair share of sexual sin, and I've thanked God on more than one occasion, by his grace, to this point, he has protected me from situations that could have turned into an affair. But most importantly, I've allowed myself to receive his grace and forgiveness. I hope you can too. So Jesus raises the bar, so to speak. He starts closing the loophole for anyone who might try to exercise a false righteousness because they hadn't slept with someone else's wife. If you even think about someone else's wife in a sexual way, Jesus proposes, you may just as well have slept with her. An interesting side note, this actually isn't the first time that the people have heard that it's wrong to long for someone else's wife. Part of the 10th commandment actually reads, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And we'll talk more about what coveting is in a few weeks. But in a sense, Jesus is drawing out the connection between these two commandments. Another interesting observation, Jesus doesn't seem to limit the boundaries of adultery to married women, as it seems to have been when the original commandment was handed down. I suppose that either the luster or the lusty is probably married if you're going to call it adultery. And that doesn't mean that the singles out there are getting a loophole right now, because it's just called fornication in your case, and the same principles throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament apply. And on the surface, all this mental adultery may seem a little extreme. I mean, how good are we really at controlling our thoughts? I mean, if I'm entertaining sinful thoughts or an evil yet appealing idea pops into my head, but I can keep myself from acting on it, shouldn't I get points for that or something? I mean, isn't that a good thing? But if we don't want to miss the point on this, we need to make sure we have an accurate view of sin. If sin were just about the actions we did or didn't do, Jesus would seem to be expanding the scope of the prohibition. But sin is about more than just the action. In fact, the action is almost inconsequential to the reality of the sin because sin originates in our hearts. Jesus told his disciples as much. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. Our sinful actions are just outward representations of the rebellion that's already taken place in our hearts.